I'm Nancy Pearl, and this is Book Lust. My guest today at Folio in downtown Seattle via Zoom is David Laskin. David, it's so nice to have you on the show again. I love it when you write a book because that's always a good excuse for me to get to talk to you.
Absolutely. We're getting to be old friends by now, Nancy.
We are. For me, at least, emphasis on the old friends. So this is a big change. Your new book, What Sammy Knew, is fiction. Now you've had a wonderful career writing fabulous nonfiction books. The Children's Blizzard is one. The book about your family is another one. And you sort of carved out this great position as a narrative nonfiction writer. So, of course, the big question is, what made you shift to fiction?
Right. Well, I think in many ways it was the story, and in many ways it was the character at the center of the story. In the novel, her name is Tutu Carter, but in real life, Tutu is based on a real life person whose name was Ethel Foreman. So when I was growing up, both my parents worked full time. My mom was a doc, my dad was a businessman, and we had a live-in domestic worker who really raised me. I mean, she was there when I was born. I was born on her birthday. It was her favorite. It was kind of funny that she was able to say that. You know, your parents would never say, "Oh, that one's my favorite," but she was pretty frank about it. And we were very, very close. And she actually died in our house. I found her when I was 10 years old. So she was a really important figure in my life. But, you know, life went on. I grew up, went to college, wrote books, et cetera, et cetera. And after the family, the book you just mentioned about my own family, I started casting around for another subject. And it was very difficult for me to settle on anything. I think because part of the family concerned the Holocaust. I had one branch of my family that was killed in the Holocaust. And it was hard to really write another nonfiction book after that. I couldn't really grapple onto anything. Anyway, long story, at some point, you know, was sort of journaling, thinking about my past, rifling through my library. I think I took down my Bible, and my Bible was actually Ethel's Bible. I inherited it from her when she died. And I think maybe that was the trigger that I began to think about her. Like, you know, okay, she would raise me. I mean, she was a really important person in my life, but where was she from? Who were her people? What was her story? And the only facts that I remembered were two. One, I remember she told me that her grandparents were enslaved and that she had a son who died. And I started researching, and it just kind of built from there. I'd done a lot of genealogical research in the family, so I was pretty good at it. I managed to trace her family 2 generations back into slavery. They were enslaved in the northern neck of Virginia, where 3 of our first 5 presidents, all slaveholders, came from. There's a very good chance that she shared DNA with George Washington, for example, whose mother was born just a few miles from where Ethel was born. Anyway, so I thought, wow, this is fascinating. And I started really devoting myself to that. And what I discovered is that I had, let's just say, the kind of the skeleton of a book. I had her background. I was able to trace her journey through the South. She lived in Baltimore for a while. I did find the records of the son. He did, in fact, die when he was 28. But I didn't really have the heart. There were no letters. She had no living descendants. The son died childless. She had a sister who had a kid, but all her family was gone. So no letters, no journals, nothing to really get inside of her. And, you know, as I said, I was 10 when she died, and she was pretty stern and reserved. She didn't talk a lot about her inner life. Of course, we didn't ask. So, you know, there was that. Anyway, I tried to write it, and it just didn't work as a nonfiction memoir, which is kind of what I had in mind. So I thought, it was one of those taking a walk in the winter, kind of downhearted. This book, I so loved this story. I so loved Ethel. She deserves, her story deserves to be told. I mean, found her grave in Westchester. I prayed for her. I thought, I'm not done with this. So I thought, hey, I'll make it up. I'll do it as a novel. And that was really when it clicked into place. And so the character Tutu Carter is based on Ethel, and I've given her some of the backstory that I researched, but she is not Ethel. All fiction writers say this, and I think it's really annoying. Oh, based on, but not the same. But in this case, there's, temperamentally very different, but circumstantially the same. So that was kind of the kick in the pants that got this all going.
So based on, but not the same. I mean, that's always one of the first questions I think that a fiction writer gets is, did you make up all these characters? And, what I found in my writing of my novel was that I would take a little bit from this person and a little bit from that person and just put them all together and make this new character out of it.
Yeah, I very much did the same. Some are invented out of whole cloth. Well, here's an example. One of the important characters in the book. So the book is, let me just kind of sketch it in briefly. So it's set in 1970. Sammy, the hero, is a high school senior. He's a little bit of a late bloomer. He goes to a wild and crazy New Year's party, falls in love for the first time. And the girl he falls in love with is named Kim. And she turns out to be a political firebrand, 1970. So we're at this really, a period that is so eerily similar to our own. The student, protest movement is morphing into the Weather Underground. What we would now call domestic terrorism is beginning to emerge. There's bombings, in major cities. Of course, in those days, it was the radical left that were the troublemakers. Now it's the radical right. But anyway, so Kim is a really important character, and she was made up out of whole cloth, except I tried to model her political views, and she's very outspoken, on one of my kids who is very radical. And I tried to think, well, would Emily say this? Would Emily believe this? So that's an example of a bit in piece. There's one character, I'm not going to name him, but there's one character in which I took the backstory of a high school friend and kind of the kind of front story, let's say, the circumstances of another friend, and mashed them together. So it's, but I do find, getting back to switching from nonfiction to fiction, I found in nonfiction, when you get stuck, you just do more research. Go to another archive, find another trove of letters, go on genealogy.com, ancestry.com, dig more, interview more, find out more, and your book will be enriched. In fiction, it's kind of invent more, be more creative, really. So I really kind of gave myself permission to take those flights of fancy. And it was hard, but when I started writing the book, Sammy was 10, the same age I was when Ethel died. And, I felt like I kind of needed to remain close to what actually happened. And then at some point I cut the tether, and that's when it took off. And, so I think kind of in some ways, the more you make up, the better it is. I always need to see the people I'm writing about. Sometimes I base them on characters on a TV show or what have you. Not so much the character, but the physicality. It's very important for me to have a sense of what they look like, how they walk, what they have in their pockets. I mean, this one kind of one of the little, writing workshop, little, jogs to
like
get
a prompt or
a
something.
prompt. Exactly. And, it's funny, some characters just kind of came out full blown. I mean, especially, I would say the male characters. I had an easier time, and I think this is probably pretty common. I just knew them. I knew what they had in their pockets. I didn't have to think about it. I knew what they had for breakfast. I knew the jokes they would make. With the female characters, especially Kim, who I talked about, the political firebrand, I kind of knew her politics, but I didn't know what she had in her pockets. And so it took a little more work to put myself in her shoes.
So with that work, which is basically thinking, right? Um, when I was working on George and Lizzie, I did so much of my best thinking on my walks. Even though I would be listening to an audio book, somehow on some subconscious level, I would be working out something. What is that? Something? Where'd you do your best thinking?
In the pool. I'm a swimmer. Often I would be swimming laps. That would help. Shower is another one. I guess there's a water theme here. And the book is originally called Dead in the Water. So, and there's definitely there's water imagery that goes throughout. But, it's funny. Sometimes I would write a scene and I would think, something not quite right here. And often at the end of the day, I'd be having a glass of wine, looking at the sunset, and I suddenly it would flip like, oh, I know what's wrong here. It's the motivation or whatever. It just, I think odd things like that, odd moments where you just kind of see beyond, um, what you've done. But the other thing, um, I used to be, um, I would say opposed to, but indifferent to writers' workshops. I thought, not for me. I don't really need that. I'm so advanced. I'm at a stage of my career but I joined a writers group, I guess, or a writers. Oh, I don't even know how to describe it. It's called Fish Trap, and it's based in Eastern Oregon, where we have a cabin, and they have convention, they have meetings, gatherings of writers, they have workshops, some of which go on through the year. And I actually taught a workshop and for Fish Trap based on Ivan Doig's work. Ivan Doig was my mentor, a very important person, and he also was inspirational in making this switch from nonfiction to fiction. And I started, kind of workshopping my own work. And I found that was helpful too. So I think you get the little light bulbs that go off in the pool or on the walk, but sometimes it would be okay, let's workshop this. What's missing here? Why are you struggling with this scene? Do you not really understand what's going to happen? Let's break it down. And so I think it's kind of those two halves of the brain, the analytical and the intuitive. And I think I used to distrust, oddly, the analytical, thinking, oh, it's all inspiration. It's just going to come to me. But, I've actually come to really value the workshop process and that sense of, let's analyze this and really see the component parts. And that was really helpful. And it continues to be helpful.
So when you're writing nonfiction, you really basically have the story, and you have the beginning, and you have the ending already. So you don't, I imagine that it's not the same process as, you don't need a storyboard in a way, and the progression is there made for you. So how did you handle, did you outline, oh good, I sense a story behind that answer. What'd you do?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure it's a story, but this is probably revealing just in my process. And I'm sure there are going to be writers out there who are rolling their eyes like, what? You wrote a book that way? I feel like with fiction, if I don't come up with something new and expected every day, I'm not doing it right. So I was really open to the serendipitous. And just like, wow, I didn't know that was going to happen. So Sammy is rife with that. And that was actually the part I enjoyed the most. And I'll give one example because I don't think it'll give too much of the plot away. So Sammy, as I said, gets involved with Kim, who's this firebrand, and they're growing up. I mean, they grew up outside New York City, just as I did. But the city is the place where real life happens. And so they cut school, they're high school seniors, they cut school one day and they go to a demonstration in Midtown, an anti-draft demonstration. And there's some speakers, and the speakers are kind of boring and mundane. And Kim says, "Oh, I can do better than that." So she mounts the dais, whatever, and grabs the megaphone and starts speaking. And this guy in the audience, so Sammy's there, just kind of, wow, she's amazing. And this guy standing next to him goes, "Who is that red-haired firebrand?" And Sammy says, "Oh, her name is Kim Goodman, and she's wonderful." He sees the guys writing it down, and suddenly it dawns on Sam that this guy maybe is an FBI agent, because they were, all the radical groups were infiltrated. We now know, but I don't think it was well known then. So Sammy steals the notebook and flees. I had no idea that was going to happen. So that was the kind of thing where I knew the big arc. I mean, I knew that Sammy was going to fall in love. I knew that Tutu and her life would be affected by his running away from home and his involvement with politics. But yeah, there was a lot that I didn't know, really pretty much right up to the end. I mean, there is a character, I don't want to get too much away here, but bad things happen. And I didn't even know who the baddest things would happen to. So I'm not sure I would recommend that as a method necessarily. But I think that it kept me stimulated. And I also think, in some ways, when I started writing this book, I thought of it as a YA, a young adult book. The characters are young. They're at that pivotal time in life, really between childhood.
Or as we say now, the inflection point.
The inflection point, yes, I like that term. And I like reading about kids. I like good YAs myself. I like how direct they are. I mean, I love the fact that in a YA, kids can sit down and go, "So, do you believe in God? Do you believe in life after death? What's moral?" And, in an adult novel, it would be like, "Oh, come on, that's so corny." We can hear the machinery clanking. But in a YA, you can get away with it. So I thought, I want a lot of plot. It's got to be a lot of plot. And so I think in some ways that those twists and turns, my openness to the twisting and turning of the plot was really grounded in the fact that I had conceived of it as a YA.
Mm-hmm. In your fiction that you read, is plot what you're looking for?
Kind of. I mean, I have to say, I'm a pretty sophisticated reader. I'm a wide reader. But I would say there are two kind of essential things. One, plot is maybe too derogatory a word, but story. I just have to get engrossed. I have to care. I have to partly want to find out what happens, but partly just get attached to the people that I'm reading about. And number two is voice. And I think they're related. But, I can tell 2 pages in if the voice is flat or it just doesn't grab me. I mean, there's some books that, everybody loves. Oh my gosh, but I don't know. It grates on me. It falls flat, what have you. So, but I mean, I don't just read to escape, but I do read to escape. And it's not, but I'm a snob. I have to say that. I mean, I will read Donna Leon, but, other genre fiction, I tend to, I mean, it's not that I think it's bad. Some of them I think are great, but it's just not my thing. I know what I like, and it has to have something of a vibrant voice, and I have to get involved in it in some ways. I mean, I think there are authors like Sebald who there's really no plot in his book, like the Rings of Saturn, somebody sort of wandering around. They're very meditative. It's beautiful. I would say in those books, the voice is much more important than the plot or characters. But again, I think the voice is so mesmerizing and so kind of mysterious that it becomes a character in its own right. But yeah, I would say I want to lose myself. I mean, that's part of the reason I should lose myself and find myself. That hasn't changed.
And that's what I've always said about what a library should consist of, that a kid especially should be able to find him or herself in a library and lose him or herself in a library.
Yeah. I mean, I was one of those kids, and I'm sure you were the same, who just, I was a bookworm. And I remember my parents, I had an aquarium in my bedroom when I was a kid, which had a light. And my parents would tuck me in, turn off the lights, and I would turn on the aquarium light and start reading. Right. And, I was one of those kind of kids. And if I don't have a book, I remember we went backpacking once, and, every ounce counted. I mean, I think we measured out the toothpaste. And I tore, like 40 pages out of a novel. This was pre-Kindle. Because I thought, I'm not going to survive for 2 days in the wilderness with nothing to read. No way.
Yeah, so that's how I was. That's why I hated going to camp, to sleepaway camp, because you could never take enough books.
Oh, I know. I still remember in camp, I got there, my first night of camp, and my mother had given me these books, and the counselor said, "Oh, these are too mature." And he just kind of threw them out and gave me Mad Magazine, which I didn't have a problem with Mad Magazine, but I wanted my books.
Did you find writing the novel more difficult than your nonfiction, and why? Why do you think that was the case?
Yeah, yes, I did. And I think in part because I realized at some point that every scene, every character, every image, everything had to be there for a reason. I think in nonfiction, and I think this can lead to problems with nonfiction, but I think often when you discover stuff, you have to put it in. Oh my gosh, here's the report card in first grade of Lyndon Johnson. We got a C in comportment. That's so cool. You just put it in and somehow, I'm Robert Caro, he puts everything in, but somehow he makes it fascinating. But I think in fiction, it has to serve something, deepen the character, deepen the theme, reveal something. It can't just be charming or evocative. And so I think that sense made it hard. I also think the infinite freedom was in some ways both liberating and suffocating. Whose point of view am I going to tell this scene from? Should I open with action or should I open with description? And it reminds me of, I was once in the supermarket and this woman was standing behind me in the pasta aisle and she said, "Too many choices. How can we decide?" And I think that was, I think that was an issue for me, and then the third thing is I think in nonfiction, in narrative nonfiction, which I wrote, I did write often in scenes where people enter, they're in a schoolhouse, the storm comes up, they leave the school, they get lost. It's very dramatic. But I think scenes in fiction work differently. There has to be, and again, to go back to the workshop model, I think every scene, by the time you get to the end of the scene, something has to have happened. Somebody's changed, the plot has been advanced, there's some bombshell that has, been unleashed on the reader, what have you. And I think those are tough disciplines. And I think I was more used to either writing these, nonfiction scenes, which were so based on research, so that going back to the Children's Blizzard, I went to the Midwest many times. I would walk from the location of the schoolhouse to where the children had been found. I would interview the community members to get a sense of for example, their faith. There were a lot of, very religious people that I wrote about. But in fiction, it's just all on you. And that's good. I mean, it's exciting, but it's almost like too much freedom sometimes.
Yeah, scary.
Scary, exactly. Intimidating. The other thing is, I think part of the reason I thought of this as a YA is that when you sit down to write a novel, there's Tolstoy, there's Henry James, there's Dickens. Oh my gosh, forget it. I'm just gonna. I can't. I can't throw my head in that ring. Of course, there are amazing nonfiction writers too. Who, John McPhee. Oh my gosh, I can't write in that genre. But somehow it's less crushing because I think when you have a good story, I'm going to write about, a storm that hit the Midwest. So many kids died. This is something that changed communities. Okay, maybe I'm no John McPhee, but I've got some great material here. Whereas with fiction, yeah, they're just giants looking over your shoulder going,
Right.
"Mm."
Yeah, and in some ways you're just so much in the dark, and whether you're an experienced novelist or not, I think just trying to find your way through what's in your head and getting it down on paper.
Absolutely. And I can't emphasize too much. Let's, go back to the workshop model, the show don't tell. Just that alone, I know it's a terribly hackneyed cliche, but it just helped me a lot. It got me out of a lot of narrative, dead zones where I thought, well, here's another example. In the first draft of the novel, I realized half the scenes or maybe more were the kids sitting around kitchen tables or diners or living rooms chatting. I thought, oh, come on, these kids have to do something. You can't just talk. It's not a play. Get them out in the streets, get them protesting, get them jumping out of buildings or whatever. Action, action, action. And I think that was difficult to do. Sometimes it seemed action for the sake of action, whatever. It was just, but I think it really brought out their inner selves powerfully, dramatically. But those were muscles I had to develop and then remember to use.
Well, I think we have to stop now. So this has been an episode of Book Lust with now novelist David Laskin. David, thank you so much for being on the show again. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
The same, Nancy. I love your show. I love your work. I love what you've done for books and writers and readers. So,
oh, thank you. Thank you. We'll see you again.
okay, take care.
Bye-bye.